Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the public lecture on planning for risk in transportation planning in the face of climate change by Professor Ruth Steiner. Before we start, I would just like to ask how many of you were here yesterday at the academic workshop? One, okay. Okay, so Ibu Ruth is here again today to give you a public lecture. And before we start, I would like to formally introduce her. Professor Ruth Steiner is a lecturer and researcher at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, University of Florida. She obtained her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Her areas of expertise include growth management, land use, sustainability, and transportation. Her research interests include transportation policy and planning, land use and transportation interactions, and multimodal transportation planning. And one of her publications is a chapter in a book titled Energy Efficiency and Human Activity, Global Trends and Prospects. So without further ado, let's invite her to the stage. Please give a round of applause for Professor Ruth Steiner.
Thank you very much for that warm but welcome. So what I'm presenting today, I'm going to step down here, get a little closer to everybody. What I'm presenting today is some ongoing research funded by the Florida Department of Transportation. And what they were trying to understand is, as we plan for the future, how do we think about the risks that we're facing in transportation planning? And how do we incorporate them in our thinking about planning? And I would say that this time in transportation planning, but in general, because of what's happening in transportation, cities are changing very rapidly. And I'm really very happy that the Smart City group invited me to come here, because I've learned a lot by looking around your city and thinking about, in Jakarta, and thinking about how we need to really plan for an interconnected global world. But I would also point out that while my presentation today will be focusing on planning for Florida, I would ask you to think, as I go through the sources of risk, how they might interact with what's happening here in Indonesia and in your own community. But just to put this in context, next slide. So, oh wait, one more. Stay back there. This image is specifically included here because this is some scenarios of what Miami Beach, or the city of Miami, might look like after sea level rise, as expected over the next several decades. You can begin to see that we have water in many places where we don't want water, and we will face many, many questions about how do we think about and plan for a very large metropolitan region in Florida? But my understanding is that Jakarta is sinking and is very vulnerable to flooding because of what's happening within the city. And you're on a coastal area, as are many cities, many major cities across the world. And in the face of sea level rise, we're all going to have to think about how are we going to deal with what are scenarios like this. Next slide, please. Just so we can begin to understand each other in the some of the terminology that I'll be talking about. This is a risk framework that is been developed for departments of transportation, but it can also be seen as being very general in terms of risk. What you have that creates risk is, first of all, you have a threat. What is it? You have a change. Some of the changes may be very gradual. Think about changing in population characteristics. They happen a little bit at a time. Sea level rise itself is very gradual, although some of the other things associated with climate change, like weather-related and more intense storms, and some of those things are episodic. So really understanding this threat is difficult. There's also what I would say in the threats is, so some of them happen gradually, some of them happen very abruptly. But the other thing is there's certain things for which we have thresholds. You might be able to, if just as in the carbon emissions in the atmosphere, 350 units is sort of seen by some people as a threshold. There are some things that have thresholds over, we can go along until we reach a certain threshold, and then things get really bad very quickly. So that threats is the first thing we need to think about. A second thing is, what are those consequences of the threats? In a natural area, in a natural ecosystem, sea level rise may gradually change nature, but because it may affect certain animals. So you may lose certain species because their habitat may change. But that will not have the same kind of consequences as something that happens in a major urban area. Similarly, targeted assets, what's going to happen? You may have certain parts. Remember, in the way I think about it in transportation system is that the transportation system is a network. And sometimes you can work around, if you have redundancy in that network, if you have multiple means of getting from point A to point B, you may be able to work your way around a specific asset going out because of sea level rise, for instance. On the other hand, there are certain critical links in the infrastructure that are really important and very costly to move or fortify. So understanding the nature of the assets, and this was attempting to look at all modes of transportation. We'll see some examples later on where my students did some modeling of what happens with sea level rise in Florida to different assets. Finally, vulnerability is the idea that certain places may be more vulnerable than others. Certain populations may be more vulnerable. So this gets into what I would say is characteristics of the population and who lives where. So as an example, you could have a major storm, and we saw this in the United States. Puerto Rico, which is a commonwealth of the United States, was hit by Hurricane Maria, which then came to hit parts of the United States in Florida. But because the populations of Puerto Rico are lower income, they may have, and the rural populations were hit much harder than the urban populations, for example. So there is a notion, and U.S. people on the mainland did better than the people in Puerto Rico because they're wealthier and they have access to a lot more resources. So vulnerability is different. There's unequal vulnerability, and when we're starting to look at vulnerability, we also get into questions of equity and the challenges of in the face of changes. And I'm going to I'll go to the nature of changes in a moment, but when we're looking at changes, we really need to recognize that certain groups of people may be better off, and there's always these questions of how can you make some people better off without making others worse off. Next slide, please. So just to put this in context, most of you, how many of you have been to the United States? A few of you, just so you know where we are. This is a map of the United States. North of us is Canada. South of us is Mexico. And there we have 48 states in the continental part of the U.S. And then we have Alaska, which is way north, and Hawaii, which is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Florida, just when you look at, I've circled it here, is in the southeasternmost extreme of the United States, but where it, from a sea level rise perspective, becomes very vulnerable. First of all, in contrast to what I've seen in Java, Java has many hills. Florida is flat. So an inch of sea level rise will go further inland than in some places in the coast. So that's one thing to recognize. We have a long coastline, and just so you have a sense of urban populations, I've got a second map here which I'll go up to and show you. But if you look at urban populations, This area is where Miami is located. Miami and a large number of cities. It's very linear city. The inland in South Florida is a major ecological state, a national park called the Everglades, if you've ever heard of that, which means that we have a linear strip here, but as we get sea level rise, the Everglades will get flooded. The Tampa Bay area is here. I've also shown the transportation networks, but Tampa, again, is a peninsula. And again, it's vulnerable to sea level rise, so this area is getting a lot of attention. Jacksonville is so there's 4 major metropolitan areas, and Jacksonville is the third, and they again have some coastal. They're a little bit away from the coast. They're along a river, but that river is expected to have flooding. And finally, how many of you have been to Disney World? This is the Orlando region is inland, although the coastal areas have started seeing the effects of sea level rise. So as I'm preparing this project, I'm trying to take a broad look, but really start to think about examples at the local level that help us to understand how we think about the risk. Next slide, please. So there's 5 broad categories of risk that we looked at, and I'll go through them. So they're population, economics, environmental risks, technology, and global issues, including security. So next slide, please. So the population concerns in the U.S. are largely that our population is getting old. We are, and in a state like Florida, it's really important. Florida is a place where people go to retire because of warm weather. And so we have estimates that by 2045, 10% of the state's population will be older than 80 years old. Now think about that. Why do we care about that from a transportation planning perspective? Because we're a very low density state, and the easiest way to get around is by driving. But the ability to drive diminishes when we get over age 80. So that's the first major risk we're thinking about. A second risk that we really looked a lot at was the fact that in the United States, the boomers who were born between 1946 and 1964 were the largest generation ever. And as they've gone through school, we always had a shortage of school capacity, and then we had a dip in population, and then we have the next generation, which now the millennials are now the largest population group. Millennials being born from 1981 to 1996. So they're now getting into the work world. They're starting to get married and form families, all of those things. And what has been happening is there is a recognized difference between millennials in terms of how they travel than previous generations. And it's been difficult to detect whether those changes are because of the market collapse of 2008, or whether that is in enduring difference in values and whether it's going to change the way things are. But there is a larger number of millennials who prefer not to drive. They prefer, they don't have driver's licenses, they aren't buying cars as quickly, all of those things. Now, some research suggests it's a relatively small percentage. On the other hand, it's in certain kinds of employment that are desirable in the more high-tech industries. And so there is some concern about whether they will choose not to live in Florida because our cities are not designed to get around without a car. So that's a second concern. A third concern in population demographics is the changing composition of increasing numbers of non-English speakers. Florida, one of the reasons I showed you the location of Florida is that it is surrounded by a large number of islands. And what we are seeing, while Puerto Rico is a part of the United States, there are other islands there, some of which are having impacts from sea level rise, from climate change. And we've had a certain migration from other countries for better economic opportunities in Florida. Except that the characteristics of those so as an example, when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, an estimated 300,000 in population moved to Florida. Now, that's relatively small, although that's about the increase in population, any annual increase in population that's been occurring in Florida. And it's important, Florida, the population, I didn't mention this, but one of the things that characterizes population growth in Florida is that Florida has been growing continuously. Going back to 1950, our population was about 3 million in 1950, and we have gained about 3 million in population every decade. About 1,000 people a day move to Florida and stay in Florida. That growth is, of course, and we have gone from being one of the small states to being the third largest state in the United States. So that population increase and where those populations are coming from, most of the population increase is coming from people migrating to Florida. About half of it are people coming from other states in the United States. The other half is coming from other countries. So we are dependent upon, and this is, the continued growth is the assumption we've built into our transportation planning, but there are questions about whether we will see that continuing growth. Next slide, please. So in economics, the question is, what kind of jobs will people have in the state of Florida? And this is largely because transportation is a derived demand based on the activities in which people engage and the alternatives they have for how they get around. So, and Florida has historically had a lot of service jobs. We have a heavy tourist industry. Those jobs are generally lower paying. They are also lower skilled. And yet at the same time, everybody prefers higher paid employment, and so there's that question. A second related issue on economics that affects transportation directly is that one of the major sources for building transportation infrastructure across the United States is the gas tax. Whenever I fill up my car with gas, I pay a federal gas tax and a state gas tax. That is then put in into a fund that then is allocated for transportation projects. Now, think about what's happened on energy efficiency and all kinds of vehicles, and you begin to recognize that we have this in the United States. Nobody wants to pay taxes, so we have not raised the federal gas tax since 1983. So that's raising half as much money as if they had attached it to inflation. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we have more fuel efficient vehicles. Electric vehicles, for instance, are producing no gas tax, except at the same time they are using all of our roads. Hybrid vehicles, I had the same car for 22 years, and I bought a Prius 3 years ago, and I used half as much gas for that vehicle, and yet I still drive about the same amount. So I'm paying half as much as I used to pay for the use of the roads. So the real question on economics is, how will we continue to provide that system that supports both the people who live there, but also the people who come to visit us. And finally, the other issue is employment. What kind of jobs will people have in the transportation sector? One of the major job categories that is considered at risk with autonomous vehicles is drivers. if you have a vehicle that can be on the roadway and that it doesn't need the driver, what happens to all the people who are driving vehicles to make money? We've been through that before with technology, but that is a very real question from an employment perspective. Next slide, please. Environment is generally that while we can be concerned about the water quality and air quality associated with the transportation sector, in general in Florida, most of the environmental concerns revolve around the direct impacts of climate change, that is the sea level rise, and storm surge, and the secondary, what I would call secondary or indirect impacts, which is as climate change continues to worsen, we are ending up with higher temperatures. So as an example, in the community I live in, I've lived there for 25 years, and 25 years ago it was pretty typical for the daily temperature in summer to be about 35 degrees centigrade. Today it's more like 35 or 36. Not a big change, very gradual. But there is a certain point where, and at night it used to be about 22. It's now about 23 or 24. Not a big change, except that if you start looking at infrastructure, we've seen the hottest days, the first years I was there, we seldom saw anything over, I'm not very good at converting from Fahrenheit. 100 degrees is about 35, I think. We saw a few days of higher than 37 or so. We're seeing more of those. The problem when you get to extreme temperatures is that, one is that even the 2 or 3 degrees will degrade the transportation infrastructure more quickly. You have expansion caused by heat. If it doesn't cool down enough at night, it doesn't contract enough. And we've had some incidents in the United States where we've had rails that have gotten too hot and have caused train derailments. So the infrastructure degradation is a serious concern with the temperature increases. Hurricane intensity is, of course, we're very vulnerable to receiving hurricanes. There is some evidence that hurricanes may go further north. But the other thing we're seeing with the intense hurricanes is it used to be, when I first moved to Florida, and everybody said that once you wait for landfall with hurricanes, because as long as they're in the water, they can intensify. But once they hit land, they lose their power very quickly. We had a hurricane called Irma 2 years ago that went straight up the peninsula of the state. And it scared everybody because we had 3 or 4 million people evacuating. We closed down businesses for almost a week because first everybody's evacuating and then everybody's returning. We're a peninsula. It's difficult to get in and out. But the other storm, we had a storm last fall that hit the western part of the state. That generally speaking, when hurricanes come, we usually have several days warning. At a certain part of the season, they come off the coast of Africa, and they watch them as they come towards the United States. We had a storm, though, last fall that started in the Caribbean and intensified to a Category 5 in 2 days. And it did not lose its strength for several hundred miles before it went over the land. So that kind of intensity is beginning to scare people. Heavy precipitation, what we're seeing, and you're seeing that worldwide. I was watching the weather a day or two ago, and they were talking about, I don't remember where it was, I think it was in northern India and such, where they were talking about 6 inches of rain. 6 inches, what is that, 15 centimeters, over a very short period of time. And the problem with the heavy precipitation in the U.S., we had a situation in Texas where they had more rain in one rainstorm than they usually have in about 5 years. Hurricane Harvey, that is what it's called. So, and the problem with heavy precipitation is that you can't build the systems. We're going from what they call the 100-year rainstorm to having a 500-year rainstorm happen every year. That's one, and in fact, we're supposed to have one such rainstorm every 100 years, and now we're getting it 1 year after another. The other thing that happens with precipitation is what's called sunny day flooding. Some of that is due to sea level rise because the waves go further inland, but suddenly you have a roadway that hardly ever floods to where it floods on a routine basis, and the number of days it floods is really the issue that we try to deal with. Next slide, please. Technology is probably the area where we're seeing the greatest change and potential change. And at the same time, this is probably the least predictable. All of you have probably heard about autonomous vehicles. We've also heard about connected vehicles. That is, my car speaks to the car in front of me so that we can drive closer together. We think ultimately we can get rid of congestion. Well, except we still have the space it takes for vehicles on the roadway. So if you begin to look at this, the technology, so that generally speaking, the technologies we think about are largely built on telecommunications. The ability of vehicles to communicate with each other, to the infrastructure, both the control systems as well as sometimes even the roadway itself, to detect when there's pedestrians or other vehicles, and the amount of technology in a car, a new vehicle is getting so much better. The promise of, that's one set of technology. The other technology change we're talking about relates directly to climate change and emissions, is a transition from fossil fuel, carbon-based fuels like oil and gasoline to something else, something that is more environmentally friendly. Whether it is solar hydrogen fuel cells, or it is biofuels, or it's electricity. We have a great deal of uncertainty about what we are transitioning from and to. I would say that in some respects, this is probably the one of the greatest areas of uncertainty in terms of thinking about risk. And it also intersects with large parts of economy. It's also happening very gradually. But as a simple example of thinking about that. And the challenge associated with these two are sort of, I think, distinct. The technologies itself is you're going to start running into the ability of various technologies to interact with each other. What is the interoperability is what we call that. The promise is an integrated network, the ability possibly, if you want to think about technology, think about what the smartphone has done to transportation. We've gone from, it used to be you called to make a reservation to get a taxi. Now we just look at our smartphone and say, okay, can you be here now? So that some of those technology, and the promise of technology is great, but the question is, how quickly will it change and how quickly can it change? The other questions are, how do we protect it from cyber attacks? You can begin to understand how somebody could bring down a whole city by going into their transportation system network. The other issue on fuels is what sources are you going to go to? How quickly will we have it? We've seen major changes in battery technology. One of the challenges of electric, but no matter what fuel we go to, we have to have the infrastructure to support it. So right now, we have gas stations everywhere. They're all over the city, they're all over the country, nobody worries about it. But if I have an electric vehicle and I want to go anywhere, can I be assured that I have the ability to charge my vehicle and to charge it quickly? And now, what's happening in the United States, and I'm not sure what's happening here. I'd love to hear a little bit about what's happening here. You're starting to see more electric vehicle fueling stations. The other thing that has happened is the range of electric vehicles has extended significantly. 20 years ago, 40 to 100 miles was about the range. Now we're talking 300 miles with a Tesla. And Tesla has almost like a membership station. If you have a Tesla, you can go to a Tesla recharging station. And they're often located along the interstate highway, but they're not everywhere. And so it's just going to take a long time to create that technology to be able to support the changing vehicle fleet. But certainly transportation sector, from a fuel standpoint, in Florida, transportation is now the major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So we can only get better by going to some other source of fuel. But at the present time, throughout the United States, and with the only place we're seeing other major fuel, 90% of the fuel in the United States consumed in the 92% of the fuel consumed in the United States is fossil fuel-based petroleum, carbon-based fuels. If you begin to think about and that used to be 98%. So we've made a little bit of progress. The one place where you see a lot of non-fuel, fossil fuel-based is electrified transit systems in urban areas. But in general, every other aspect of the system is based on fossil fuels. But if you begin to imagine what happens when you bring in autonomy into the system, you still have a whole other set of questions. So using an example, we think about many people believe that truck convoys will become one of the first applications. Intercity trucks. Currently, we have a shortage of drivers for our trucks. They go long distances at the present moment. We have, for safety reasons, we have limitations on the length and number of hours that a driver can drive. So from trucking company perspective, you can imagine that there is a strong incentive to think about autonomous trucks. Why? Because they can drive 24 hours straight. We can have, even if we have a remote driver, they still can keep on the road. Where they become difficult to use is when you get into urban settings, of course. But you would have greater efficiency. But then you start getting into questions of how do you fuel? What do you do when your autonomous truck runs out of electricity? How do you keep things going? How do you set up the infrastructure to support that? That's one piece. The other piece, I would argue, is actually institutional, which is that currently in the United States, trucking, if you look at a roadway, if you wanted to do truck platoons, you would have to have a separate lane. The question of who pays for that separate lane is really far from settled question. And a part of it relates to how you build your roads. The width of the road is built to support all the cars that are on the road. The depth of the road is built to support trucks. And there are some evidence in the literature that in general we subsidize trucking because of the extra cost associated with building those facilities. And if we were to go to separate truck-only lanes, the cost of getting services to my house would get more expensive. So there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of opportunities. Who wouldn't feel like one of the promises of autonomy is improved safety? Although the challenge is that what we say about autonomy is that a 99% autonomous system with 1% driver is much less safe than a 100% autonomous system. But getting there is also another set of questions. Are individuals going to give up owning cars? How do you deal with the aging of the fleet? We already have millions of cars out there on the road. Am I one day going to say, okay, I'm going to let you have my car because I'm going to use an autonomous vehicle? Am I going to own an autonomous vehicle, or in which case we have the same kind of congestion we have now? Or are we going to have shared autonomous vehicles, which are estimated to reduce the number of vehicles on the road by a factor of somewhere between 7 and 10? That is, one autonomous vehicle can support what 7 to 10 vehicles currently support. So all of this has serious implications for how the vehicles in our city, possibly even the redesign of automobiles. Next slide, please. And finally, global issues. Some of the issues here are security, cybersecurity, terrorism. Probably these are the most difficult to control, predict, estimate, and yet we know that cyber attacks are likely to happen. What part of the system is affected is questionable. The other issue partly relates to climate change and sea level rise, which is climate change refugees. Are we going to say, like the movement from after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, are we going to see large numbers of people moving to the United States or to other places? And what is that going to do to our economy? What is that going to do with to our transportation system? How are we going to manage the people who are coming in? Next slide. So those are the 5 major sources of risk in transportation. Perhaps we can have a discussion at the end of this of how they're affecting Indonesia. I would find that rather interesting. What I'm going to present here is some work by my students where we began to look at the single question is, if we have sea level rise, as is predicted, what are the impacts we would see on coastal communities? One of the things I neglected to mention with Florida is that we have about 20 million in population, but about 80% of that population lives within 10 miles of the coast. So if we have serious questions about what will happen, as I mentioned, 3 of our major urban areas are near the coast. Generally, we're expected to have the population increase is expected to also go into those coastal areas. So the numbers of people are projected in the coastal area who are vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise and storm surge increases. Next slide, please. So what we did was we looked at the impacts on vulnerable populations. We looked at the impacts on future populations, roads and property, critical infrastructure, that's things like ports and airports, and not just the facility itself, but also the roadways leading up to it. And finally, what happens with our rail system. Next slide, please. So the projections on sea level rise are quite variable. What I am told, and I'm not an expert on sea level rise per se, but is that we're looking at anywhere from 1 foot, which is curve 5, the low estimate, to 7 feet. Remember that Florida is very flat. So when you're talking 7 feet, you're talking about a significant movement inland and significantly vulnerable numbers. This is not even by 2100, this is by 2080 is the year we used in our estimates. We looked at all three of these in our estimates. I don't want to go into all the detail, but except to say that we established that there was serious vulnerability. Next slide, please. So if we begin to look at vulnerable populations, this is people who are old enough that they don't drive, people who are too young to drive, and other people who cannot drive because of cognitive or physical disabilities. Or the other piece that we don't necessarily show here is, or we talked a lot about, was populations. Was populations who are too low income to own a car, which we are not accounting for. This is only showing the populations that are over 65, that is aging population. But we're talking about 40,000 in Miami-Dade County, which is where the city of Miami is located, the largest county. Now, why do we care about the vulnerable populations? Largely because when we think about evacuating, we have to find a way to get those people out. And we don't want to make life more difficult during an extreme event for people who are already vulnerable. So these numbers are, this is based on current populations. We're expecting more populations to move in those areas. We're also expecting that population to age. So this probably underestimates the impacts. Next slide, please. Future populations, we're talking about, using the estimates, by 2070, we're talking about almost 2 million people who may be in the path of sea level rise. But the question becomes then, which is, where are those people going to move? Are they going to move inland where we don't have transportation to support them? Or how are we going to move away from the coast in an orderly manner? Next slide, please. This one is looking at roads and property, and basically the bottom line is that number at the bottom of the page, which shows that we're talking about somewhere around $200 trillion in loss if we end up going to the highest levels of benefit, at the highest levels. We're also talking over 400 miles of roadway. What is that? That's kilometers, 1.6. About 500 kilometers would be underwater. And parcels affected is about 500,000. So we're talking about a significant impact on just the state of Florida. This is not even looking at what happens in other states in the United States. Next slide, please. Critical infrastructure, a couple of things that we find, especially with the high, is that we expect both the Port Everglades, 2 of our major ports would be underwater. Now, while you sort of think, well, okay, you've got other ports, except that you begin to think about all the economic activity generated at each one of these ports. That's one issue. The second issue is we're only talking about the ports. We're not talking about the roadways leading to them. So again, this will have major impacts in multiple ways. Next slide, please. Similarly, we expect to have some problems on the rail system, especially when in fact, there are some counties that are affected even when you have relatively low. The curve 1, you already start to see some impacts on our roadway, on the rail infrastructure. And the challenge with the rail infrastructure is that we don't have a very well developed rail system. Next slide. So how do we think about addressing the risks? Next slide, please. So the first thing is to really think about what do we need to do to reduce CO2 emissions, both individually but as communities. And really it's about identifying where we're vulnerable, doing some analysis, and this is what would be called resiliency planning. but it's also resiliency action and sustainable action. So next slide, please. Another example is to think about what do you do in coastal areas that are quite vulnerable. This is an example taken from the state of Louisiana, which is where the city of New Orleans is located. It's on the Gulf Coast, southern United States. But some of you may remember from 2005, Hurricane Katrina came through, and New Orleans, like Jakarta, is below sea level. And when the hurricane came through, there was enough water that the dikes collapsed, and there was significant flooding, such that some neighborhoods were completely wiped out. That state has, and you can barely see it, there's a lake, I believe this is Lake Pontchartrain, which is a part of that system. But the destruction of the wetlands leading on the coast were seen as a part of the explanation for why the storm did not lose its power. So that the state of Louisiana has engaged in a major plan for how they manage these wetlands, including things like building barrier islands, doing more shoreline protection, restoring the ridges, restoring some of the so these are some of them are hard, soft solutions, and some of them are hard protection. But they went through and looked at creation of marshes, sediment diversion, hydraulic restoration. So a lot of these are what you could see as just taking the existing system and restoring parts of it so that it's less vulnerable later on. Go ahead, next slide. And we also need to think about resiliency planning. Go ahead. And from a transportation perspective, we need to think about how we make more efficient use of the existing transportation infrastructure that's out there. That's all I have for my presentation, and I will welcome questions.
Okay, maybe from the audience, anyone would like to ask a couple of questions?
Maybe I'll ask a question.
Oh, that's...
So what is the risks in transportation planning in Jakarta? So population, what's happening with population? Go ahead, here we have a microphone.
The big problem of the most high risk in Jakarta especially, it is high populations because many people live here from around the region from Indonesia have the biggest problems because of it needs to have the system of transportation as well, I think.
So population growth. You also I heard sea level rise, but maybe somebody can talk about that.
Oke, menurut saya di Jakarta adalah konektivitas ya, hubungan antar beberapa moda yang menurut saya belum terintegrasi. Jadi kadang kita susah untuk berpindah moda transportasi.
I'm going to have, I guess.
He mentioned that in Jakarta, the transportation that we have aren't connected enough. So we have different modes of transportation like MRT, the bus, but they're not connected. So it's hard for us to go from one place to another.
That's a very important factor in thinking about this. And that's, I would say, in the United States, a couple things. About the last 20 years or so, we've had a major emphasis coming from the national government to regions, saying here's extra money to make connectivity better. But that is that connectivity is a real challenge and really important. What are some other? What's the expectation on sea level rise? Is that expected to start flooding here? There's someone back here. Ah,
In my opinion, it's safety that it's quite an issue for Jakarta because I know it's like changing transportation. Maybe it's related to the crowded also, but I think it's also like you mentioned about cyber safety, but also safety on the road. That it's also quite an issue in Jakarta. Thank you.
so it may relate to the point this gentleman made about interconnectivity, which is that if you don't assume people are going to travel from one mode to the next, and you don't provide the ability, that's one piece. I think the other challenge is I've seen it. So road safety is actually, in the international context, why don't I say this? Florida has the greatest problem with pedestrian safety of any state in the United States. And we keep trying to deal with it, but in the international context, the road safety is relatively safe in Florida compared to many other places. Having walked on, what is striking when I came here is how difficult it is to be a pedestrian. I can't imagine. Well, I've done it in India, but like India, the idea of crossing a street is extremely difficult and not easy. Sometimes you have to go up and walk up and then walk back down. But if you're not very mobile, it would be very difficult. So I certainly, road safety is, I think, is definitely an issue. There is a movement. I didn't talk a lot about safety here, but there is an international movement called Vision Zero. Have any of you heard of Vision Zero? It started in Sweden. And has been moving across cities across the world that are, and it's changing the thinking about road safety. And the idea in Vision Zero is to say our goal is to have no fatalities. And to say if the problem is if we don't design the system for people, then you're going to have people who are killed because we're not treating the pedestrians. If you don't have a place for pedestrians to go in your transportation system, how can they safely go there? I think in the U.S., in Florida at least, the data I've looked at tends to suggest that the most vulnerable are those who don't have cars, who are low income, and who can't easily get around. That's one grouping. The other is, like here, the major roadways might be 6 lanes, 7 lanes wide, and take a long distance to cut across. And we don't always accommodate the pedestrian in crossing that street. So it's when a street becomes a barrier rather than a connector. The Vision Zero says engineers need to rethink how they design. And it's being, I would encourage you to look at it, to think about how you would have to change your transportation infrastructure. At the same time, I would say that I can imagine it is extremely difficult to think about how you build a transportation network here, because you had an existing settlement and then more and more people started owning cars, and suddenly you need to think about how are we going to move vehicles through the center of the city. Yes?
Thank you, Professor Steiner, for the wonderful presentation. My name is Aryo. I'm anthropologist. I'm the staff at the Department of Anthropology here at Universitas of Indonesia. So seems that from your presentation, one of the urgent solution is also about social planning, right? So I'm wondering about how to include like interdisciplinary aspect in the process and how to make a, because I think it requires like paradigm shift, right? Not only in technological aspect, but also in social and political aspect.
That is a very excellent question. And I would say it's one reason we need to do interdisciplinary research. Because I don't think we know.
Are you doing that in your project? Or
we can't keep an anthropologist. No, we had an anthropologists and psychologists are the two that work on this. We do now have human factors researchers who are in industrial and systems engineering. But I do think I agree with you that there is a sociological question related to this, that I would say there's lots of people attempting to understand this, but there's much more work needed. Understanding how you change behavior. There have been a number of studies trying to figure out what it would take for more people to use public transit, for instance, which is seen as a more sustainable form of transport. But when we start looking at it, the experience is a factor, people's expectations, and ultimately I think convenience keeps winning out. It's much more convenient for me to walk into my garage, pick up my car and start driving than it is for me to walk 2 blocks across a 5-lane road to catch a bus. The changes we need to make. Now, I will also say that some of this relates to a lot of what I read sort of talks about, I keep reading things that talk about the fact that we still have designed our transportation system around the automobile instead of around people. And until we begin to think about how people interact in that system and how to recreate the incentives to change people's behavior, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that. You'll have to find teams to join because we need you. Are there any other questions?
Yes. Hello, Dr. Steiner. I'm Santi. I'm from ITB, Staff Urban and Regional Planning.
She was also my student, so she came to US to study with me.
Okay. Yes, it was back in 2009 to 2013.
Mm-hmm.
I'll answer your question before. I mean, I will highlight the importance of having early warning system. That maybe, in my opinion, we have a lack of early warning system, especially for example the storm surge. Like if the heavy rain come, or in which place that we are going to have flooding, and we try to evacuate people in early time, not after it happens. Right. That needs actually data and also research, deep research about it.
I also think it needs the assistance of our anthropologists here also to recognize that some people in the face of warnings don't necessarily respond, which is they become accustomed to what's happening. And the other challenge is that some of these changes are very gradual and you get used to it. Or you might, so once you become used to it, when it's, what's the difference between a routine activity and something that really means you need to move? There's a lot of there's a lot of responses of individuals and groups to that really needs to be understood better.
Any other questions, or maybe anyone would like to add their thoughts?
Thank you. I've been wanting to ask this. Do you have have you ever seen somewhere that's similar to Jakarta in terms of transportation problem? Because what that sir said about the disintegrations of the public vehicles, it's not merely that you don't know what to do when you want to go from point A from point B, which vehicles that you need to take, but it's also the matters of private sectors who's taking over certain routes, and then there are also duplicates of routes, and then the amount of vehicle that does not correspond with the amount of traffic that the routes usually has. So we found, well, people don't necessarily go by bus or by other smaller vehicles using some kind of strict schedules, unlike in Japan, for example. So we tend to wait the sideways, if there's any sideways, and then we just kind of, hitchhike all the cars, the vehicles that comes, but we don't have any schedules, so that the cars also the drivers were not being paid by monthly salary. Instead, they were being paid by how many passengers that they could get on that day. Yeah, so the competition is pretty high, and then we normally found drivers do some kind of a racing each other on a daily basis because they're fighting for passengers, and that is, I think it's mostly because of that private sectors which are profit-oriented and not necessarily connected with the government. I mean, we've seen people from the government taking surveys, counting cars, and checking routes, which ones are necessary, which ones are not really that necessary, but I don't see any improvement, and I've been living here throughout my life, which is like over 30 years, and that's how it goes. So I wonder if, well, probably not in Florida. You say that Florida has high rates of some kind of, it's a very dangerous for pedestrian, but I've been there and it was like way better compared to Jakarta. So I wonder if you have ever seen anywhere else and you know what to do with this.
Boy, it's tough to come here for 10 days and have to solve the world's problems. It's a very good question. I would say what Jakarta's reminded me is of places in India, where you see similar kind of complexity of transportation. Lots of in India there were many more jitneys. Here it's motorcycles. There you would see motorcycles with a casing around it, driving passengers or moving freight or some of those things. The institutional barriers, I think, are really important. And the fear in the U.S. is this question of privatization also. What has started happening in the U.S. is that since, I know you have Grab here, we have something called Uber, I don't know if they're here, but Uber and Lyft, since they came in, while they promised decreased travel, they in fact are starting, there's a couple things they're starting to show. They can't necessarily connect it with Uber, or it's been difficult to sort that out. We've seen significant drops in transit ridership in most urban areas that have good transit. And a part of it really goes to convenience. The congestion, but some of it also goes to the question of regulating. The challenge you're describing of information is something we struggle with in the United States, which is that there is an argument generally made that if you're of social responsibility of companies, which is if they're allowed to operate, they also need to behave in a manner that's responsible. And one of those may be sharing information. Some cities have been able to share information with them, but they've not, for the most part, they have not been able to do so. And if you begin to think about shared information, the advantage of shared information is that if Uber is serving passengers in a certain place, it would be good to know whether that place might be better served by transit because there's high enough demand. But that's uncertain. And I think we have a lot of uncertainties because we are increasingly going to privatization of those kinds of services also. And going back to this gentleman's comment about connectivity, the increased competition may be a function of lack of connectivity. On the other hand, it may also exacerbate the challenges of connectivity because you may end up with even more congestion in certain places that relates to how these systems work. I think the other part of it, I've had many people ask me about your MRT system. And I think the dilemma of a system like that is that there is in transportation planning something called the network effect. The larger the network becomes, the more places it connects to, the more useful it becomes to people using that system. You've done the first phase. You always have to do a first phase in large projects. But until you get that system connecting significant regional centers, you're not going to get the benefits you want from that system. And so it's not a simple linear relationship. It's really, there's sort of some thresholds involved with its availability. I don't know enough to know about whether there are plans for better connectivity there, but I will say that in the U.S. and most urban areas are really paying a lot of attention to what's called first mile, last mile connectivity. Some of that plays out in providing service to rail systems where you have circulators or a different form of transit than the regular buses. But I already know you already have these mini buses that we don't see in many places in the U.S. We do see them occasionally. But going back to your fundamental question, the question may be, how do you, are there some things that would improve connectivity that then allow solutions that helps everybody in the system? And that will definitely require lots of information. There is an emphasis in some places in the U.S. and some European contexts, and a recognition that when we're talking about congestion, that a significant portion of the congestion in U.S. cities is associated with the design of a small number of locations. And I don't know how that applies here, but that may be something that some researchers who are doing work on congestion can begin to think about, is whether improvements and strategic investments in some kinds of interconnectivity or such may improve congestion. I don't have a sense of that, although my sense, I don't know enough to speculate on that, but a good study that looks at that, whether the congestion has a pattern to it, is probably the underlying question there. And how it connects to these lack of connectivity in areas. Although as I've looked at it, what I've thought about is you had an existing urban development pattern, and as more and more people got cars, you needed to put corridors through it. And that's a really tough proposition. I've looked at that in Shanghai and saw a similar kind of thing where it's hard to create a corridor once you have an existing development pattern. And I think that's in my mind, that's one of the things I've been seeing here that affects your ability to get around in the city. Keep working at it. Maybe that'll be your career. Are there any other questions? Yes. She's right there.
Thank you. You said earlier that there's a change in the profile of the transportation user, especially with the millennials that becomes like greater, part of the transportation users. It's undeniable also in Jakarta to have like Uber, Grab and Gojek. We have like also Gojek, and there's also coming like using what's that drone to deliver packages, and also driverless taxi. Like in Berlin, it's already legal and formal. So this kind of it's like more is coming. Yeah, more are coming. So do you have any experience or maybe like examples of like maybe that's not necessarily controlling, but more systematic integration and also controlling these new things that will be applied soon, instead of like trying it, but trying it like trial and error. It's better perhaps to have this kind of regulation, how to that we know consequences of what's coming in our transportation system. Thank you.
Oh, that is an excellent question. What I would say, is that there are a large number of small experiments with the technology in places, and then there are, and some of it's public sector driven, some private sector. As an example, in the U.S., Waymo, which is I think owned by Google, I may be wrong, has been. I don't know how many of you. If you heard about the bicyclist that was killed in Arizona, in Phoenix, this is maybe 2 years ago. They had an autonomous vehicle. They had a driver in the vehicle, but the driver was texting, and they were not using LiDAR technology to detect a bicyclist, and it was on a dark street, and basically. They did not detect a bicyclist trying to cross the street. But of course, they weren't using all the technology. So there are concerns, for example, that those kinds of events, which are what I would say is a less controlled experiment than, say, the community I live in, there's actually a flyer. Our Transportation Institute, here if I can take this. This flyer was out at the table, and it's called I Street, and basically we have been trying to experiment with four autonomous shuttles that would be on a relatively small route. And the initial, it's done in multiple phases. The first ones are on a street that is pretty wide, but it has roundabouts, which is interesting. But the first phases are just going a couple blocks between the university and a university tech transfer center. We got an operator to test these vehicles, but we cannot get a approval from our federal government to operate the vehicles. So we've been waiting almost 2 years now to get approval. And so those kinds of experiments are happening every time I go to a transportation conference. There's a major one called the Transportation Research Board in Washington, D.C. every January. And every time I go there, I hear more and more about these kind of small-scale experiments. I think the question is going to be, well, first of all, one of the things I learned doing this project is that one of the necessities for, and this makes perfect sense for those of you that are architecture, think in three-dimensional, is that most systems currently can operate in 2 dimensions. You can look at in plan, and you can figure out how you're going to get a diagonal up down the street. But when you go to a lot of these systems, you have to think in 3 dimensions, because you need to know that the tree won't hit the vehicle, or things of that sort. But the other things I've read, if you look at Google Maps, a lot of that's 3-dimensional visioning. You can do the sweep camera. I can look at my house, show you my house on Google Street View. I don't know how much, where, so where they have done that seems to be a part of understanding and using some of those technologies. I'm not sure if that's where Google expects to get the strategic advantages. They've done all this mapping. So I've heard lots of comments about people who are off the grid, but so what does that lead to is some people talk about it as a niche. The niche, it serves a small need. So you might have, like this campus looks like it could be served by some autonomous shuttles going from one building to the other. It's pretty spread out. It would be a reasonable deployment. And you might use it in a downtown going from, you might move the parking out of the downtown to make a place more walkable. You could have the shuttles going back and forth between parking and the core where people are going. I think we go, the way I've envisioned this is that I think you start with discrete applications that over time build to more of a network to where they're used in, but the initial ones probably will be in somewhat controlled environments because there will be nothing that prevents the proliferation of the technology than things not working out. So it's a very good question, and I don't have a sense of where we are on that curve. But as I say, every time I go to this conference, I hear about another city that's experimenting with this, and I think of it as quite complicated. It has all these user acceptance kind of questions. It has, think about even in the U.S. there's a really big issue about shared vehicles. Would you share a taxi with someone you don't know? It's the first question you ask. Then you ask the question, would you share a vehicle without a driver where you're the only two? Would you share? So you start, would you share a taxi? Some people say yes, some say no. The next question is, would you share a vehicle with somebody you don't know? And do you trust that person? I mean, there's all sorts of, I would argue there's a lot of human factors and user acceptability where anthropologists really are needed. And there are a number of ethical questions also. So I don't know that I've answered your question except to say there's lots of questions and lots of interesting issues associated with the proliferation of that technology. But I actually believe that Uber and Lyft really have their business models built on the idea of getting rid of the drivers. That eventually, that they're experimenting with autonomous vehicles. And while they've changed the taxi industry, and probably in the many cities in the U.S., changing the taxi industry was needed because they had a monopoly and they were behaving badly, so to speak. But whether they're not making any money, and possibly they can't make money because they may be not charging the true cost. But fundamentally, I think they're also built on this notion, which is, do we all need to own our own vehicle? Problem is, once we own it, the cost of every trip we take is relatively cheap compared to getting the vehicle in the first place. So there's a built-in incentive to drive more rather than less. So, yeah, are there any other questions? Thank you very much for your attention. Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending today's public lecture. If you still have any questions, you can approach Ibu Ruth personally because she will still be here, probably until 12, if I'm not mistaken. And for those of you who have attended and those of you who have tuned in to the live stream, you will receive your e-certificate via email. So that's all. Thank you. On behalf of Smart City, I would like to thank you again. Have a nice day.